For the United States and the Empire of Japan, July of 1942 is a time of uncertainty. From his headquarters in Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, is still stinging from the loss of 4 aircraft carriers at the Battle of Midway the month before. But with a warrior spirit steeped in the samurai tradition of his forefathers, Yamamoto is undaunted by his recent losses. Except for his carriers, his fleet is nearly intact. Japan's air forces are depleted but still deadly. And if anything, her army is even more powerful than it had been at the beginning of the war. Most importantly, however, Yamamoto is convinced that America lacks the resources to undertake a counterattack in the Pacific for many months. Determined to keep the Allies on the run, his eyes turn toward the South Pacific. It is here that the Japanese army plans an attack on Port Moresby on the island of New Guinea, an operation whose goal is the eventual conquest of Australia. Yamamoto knows that the attack will need air cover, but without enough carriers to support his warplanes, he recommends that an airstrip be built on a small nearby island in the Solomons chain. Its name is Guadalcanal. From his main base at Pearl Harbor, United States Pacific Fleet Commander Admiral Chester Nimitz sees a very different picture. Like Yamamoto, he knows that he only has meager forces at his disposal. But he's convinced that a purely defensive strategy in the Pacific will play right into Japanese hands. He believes that a limited offensive must be undertaken in order to prevent Yamamoto from consolidating the huge gains he has made since the beginning of the war. Nimitz's hopes center on an island-by-island advance in the South Pacific aimed ultimately at the huge Japanese base of Rabaul. Codenamed Watchtower, the offensive is to begin by seizing a Japanese seaplane base on a tiny speck of land called Tulagi in the Solomon Islands. By an incredible twist of fate, Tulagi lies just 20 miles away from Yamamoto's half-finished airstrip on Guadalcanal. When word reaches Nimitz of the Japanese airfield, his previous plans are scrapped. Guadalcanal is one of the few suitable places for an airbase in all of the Solomons. As a result, this once worthless piece of real estate suddenly becomes strategically priceless. Now Guadalcanal with its airfield as well as Tulagi must be taken. But the fight for Guadalcanal will eventually become much more than a battle for an airstrip. This obscure little island of barren hills and dense jungles, of torrential rains and malarial swamps, will almost accidentally become the focus of a massive land, sea, and air campaign, more savage than anything seen before in the history of warfare. A murderous war of attrition that neither side had foreseen, and that neither side wanted, but that both sides had to win. For the Japanese and American commanders, the campaign for Guadalcanal will be a long, frustrating ordeal. Some will rise to the occasion, performing with brilliant skill and bravery. Others will buckle under the strain. But for all of these leaders and the forces they command, Guadalcanal will be more than a test of strength. It will be a test of will. Nimitz knows that the invasion of Guadalcanal will be complex and difficult. He also knows that it will be made even more dangerous by the presence of such a daring and skillful opponent as Admiral Yamamoto. Born in the city of Nagaoke in 1884, Yamamoto was short and slight, even by Japanese standards. But what he lacked in size, Yamamoto more than made up for in intellect. As the sixth son of an impoverished samurai, he was encouraged to go to school, which he did with enthusiasm. First in Nagaoke, and later at the Imperial Naval Academy at Etojima, where he graduated 7th in his class in 1904. In 1917, Yamamoto was sent to the United States to study English at Harvard University. During his 2 years there, he became enormously impressed with America's economic might. He also picked up a taste for poker, a game that appealed to his natural inclination towards risk-taking. This gambler's instinct was further demonstrated by Yamamoto's devotion to the Japanese game of shogi, a strategic board game similar to chess, in which he favored rush tactics. a bold thrust at the very outset that was designed to achieve decisive results. These traits would infuse Yamamoto's battle strategies with an audacity reminiscent of the legendary British Admiral Horatio Nelson. After his return to Japan, Yamamoto switched his professional specialty from gunnery to aviation. He went on to educate the Japanese Navy on the importance of seaborne air power, which would become a dominant factor in the coming war. Then he demonstrated how lethal that air power could be when he used his own rush tactics to mastermind the daring surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. But now at 58, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, Yamamoto has conflicting feelings about the war he had launched. As a military man, he wants to destroy his country's enemies and bask in the glory of his achievements. But as a strategist and realist, he does not believe that Japan can win a long war against the virtually limitless resources of the United States. Yamamoto, however, is imbued with the samurai tradition of total loyalty, and he will do whatever his emperor asks. The American commanders he will encounter in the coming battle for Guadalcanal will be equally committed to a different cause, that of defeating the Japanese advance. One of these leaders, the man ultimately responsible for the overall conduct of Operation Watchtower, is Yamamoto's arch-nemesis in the Pacific, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. Born in Texas from German ancestry in 1885, Nimitz, like Yamamoto, came from a poor family and had to cast his fortunes with the military in order to get an education. A product of the Naval Academy at Annapolis, Nimitz rose quickly through the ranks, and along the way developed an unassuming self-confidence which enabled him to make quick, startling decisions and stick to them. It was this calm under fire, coupled with his flexibility and diplomacy, which convinced President Franklin Roosevelt to give Nimitz the job of rebuilding the shattered U.S. Pacific Fleet after its destruction by Yamamoto's carriers at Pearl Harbor. It was Nimitz who was the architect of the stunning victories at Coral Sea and Midway, which brought America back from the brink of defeat. And it was he who set in motion the planning for Operation Watchtower, the offensive that would begin America's long march back across the Pacific. Soon after planning begins, Nimitz makes a critical decision. He puts Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley, Commander, South Pacific, in charge of Watchtower. Nimitz had always shown an uncanny knack for finding exactly the right man for the job at hand. And Gormley has a well-deserved reputation as one of the brightest, most conscientious officers in the U.S. Navy. But the genial Gormley is more of a thinker than a fighter. In the coming months, this will prove to have a dramatic effect on the conduct of the campaign. Gormley wastes no time in making it clear that he has doubts about the operation. He's acutely aware of the lack of resources that has led many U.S. officers to dub Operation Watchtower Operation Shoestring. He moves his base of operations to Noumea, capital of French New Caledonia, and promptly asks for a postponement until his forces can achieve air superiority over Guadalcanal. But Nimitz and the Joint Chiefs of Staff insist that Watchtower must go ahead as planned. Gormley's next task is to pick the commanders of the two fleets that will jointly undertake the invasion. The choices Gormley makes will be as critical to the operation as Nimitz's choice of Gormley himself, and will prove to be equally problematic. Gormley assigns command of Task Force 61, a group of cruisers and aircraft carriers responsible for Watchtower's naval and air support, to Vice Admiral Frank Fletcher, a caution-first, kindred spirit of Gormley's. Task Force 62, which consists largely of transports to carry the ground forces and supplies, is given to the brilliant but notoriously irascible Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner. With the naval commanders in place, Nimitz himself selects Marine Major General Alexander Archer Vandegrift to lead the untried 1st Marine Division into battle. Unlike the others, this choice will prove to be a good one. Vandegrift is a quiet-spoken Virginian and a broadly experienced veteran of many campaigns, from the occupation of Veracruz in Mexico in 1914 to action in Cuba and China. By the time of Watchtower, he has been a Marine for 34 years. Known as Sonny Jim because of his coolness under pressure, Vandegrift is a tough but well-liked commander who leads by example. With the Marines in the capable hands of General Vandegrift, Admiral Gormley orders the assault forces to rendezvous at sea for a final conference before the invasion. On July 26, 1942, an impressive American naval force gathers 400 miles off the coast of Fiji. The conference takes place the next day aboard the USS Saratoga. Admirals Fletcher and Turner, commanders of Task Force 61 and 62 respectively, and General Vandegrift, commander of the ground forces, are present. One man is conspicuous by his absence, Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley. In a controversial decision, he had decided to stay at his headquarters at Noumea and finalize preparations for Watchtower. Vice Admiral Fletcher, who is extremely concerned with preserving America's scarce naval vessels in the area, is the senior officer present at the conference. As such, he is now technically in charge of the operation. Fletcher wastes no time in dropping a bombshell. Without concealing his doubts about Watchtower, he announces that he will not provide support for the landing forces for more than 48 hours. Vandegrift and the irascible Turner erupt, and a shouting match between Turner and Fletcher ensues. Turner insists that he will need a minimum of 5 days, 120 hours, to safely debark the Marines and unload their equipment and supplies from his transports. But Fletcher is adamant. He finally agrees to stretch his time limit to 72 hours, but no more. Vandegrift and Turner are left with their orders. Turner is to deposit the Marines and supplies on the beach, and Vandegrift is to take the island from the enemy, even if he has to do it without the continued support of the Navy. On the eve of the invasion, Vandegrift hints at his doubts in a letter to his wife. Tomorrow morning at dawn, we land in the first major offensive of this war. Our plans have been made, and God grant that our judgment has been sound. Whatever happens, you'll know that I did my best. Let us hope that that best will be enough. August 7th, 1942. Exactly 8 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, an American invasion fleet approaches a Japanese-held objective. At 6:10 in the morning, streaks of yellow light break through the black tropical skies and expose the scraggly mountainous silhouette of Guadalcanal. The island, codenamed Cactus, looms forbiddingly in the distance. Then suddenly the American cruisers open fire. The unmistakable roll of naval gunfire shatters the silence, setting parts of the island and the pre-dawn sky on fire. Three hours later, the assault boats hit the beach. The first of Vandegrift's 10,900 Marines moves inland. But something seems wrong. Something that even Nimitz had not planned on. There is no answering fire. There are no Japanese. Not anticipating an American attack, the Japanese had sparsely garrisoned the island with construction crews and a few combat troops. These men had taken to the hills as soon as the Allied bombardment began. Within 36 hours, the 1st and 5th Marine Regiments crossed the Tenarue River and advanced 1,000 yards to the Japanese airfield. The rising sun is brought down and Old Glory is run up. Back in Tokyo, Yamamoto has been caught completely off guard by America's bold stroke in the South Pacific. After his initial surprise, he quickly assesses the situation. By midday on August 7th, he has all the information he needs. He's convinced that the Americans' goal is to stop the capture of Port Moresby and ultimately to destroy Rabaul. The airfield at Guadalcanal will put them within striking distance of both. They must be stopped at all cost. With characteristic decisiveness, Yamamoto orders the 25th Air Flotilla at Rabaul to launch an air attack. He also approves a sortie by the Japanese 8th Fleet, which is responsible for the Rabaul area. Several hours later, 43 bombers escorted by 18 Zeros attacked the Marines on the beach and the transports in the water. The American carriers send their fighters up to engage. After a furious battle, the Japanese lose 16 planes, the Americans 12. The next day, the Japanese try torpedo bombing. 26 planes swoop down on the Americans, but the gunners on Turner's ships send 17 of the attackers down in flames. Despite their successful defense, Admiral Fletcher is alarmed by the aggressive response of the Japanese, having already lost the carriers Lexington and Yorktown at the battles of Coral Sea and Midway. The gun-shy Fletcher is determined not to lose another. Reversing his decision to Vandegrift and Turner, he withdraws his aircraft carriers from the waters around Guadalcanal 24 hours earlier than expected, leaving only his cruisers and destroyers behind. Turner and Vandegrift are furious. The Marines and the transports will now be vulnerable to enemy air attacks. Meanwhile, the Japanese 8th Fleet is steaming towards Guadalcanal. But Australian lookouts positioned on nearby islands warn Admiral Turner, the commander of the transport fleet, of the approaching ships. Turner immediately calls for a meeting with Vandegrift aboard his flagship. Turner doesn't mince words. Task Force 62, the entire transport fleet, will be pulling out first thing in the morning. Vandegrift is grim. When Turner's ships leave, they will be taking some of his troops and half of his still unloaded supplies with them. The Marines will be left virtually on their own. Later that night, the Japanese fleet of 5 cruisers and a destroyer stealthily pass right by the American screening force assigned to warn of approaching enemy ships. At 1:43 a.m., the Japanese open up with a devastating barrage. Within minutes, American warships are going down like ducks in a shooting gallery. After the battle, the Japanese take inventory. Except for some light damage, their ships are virtually unscathed. The Allies, however, end up with 4 heavy cruisers and a destroyer sunk. 1,270 seamen go down with their vessels. The so-called Battle of Savo Island is the worst defeat for the United States Navy in 130 years. But instead of exploiting their advantage over the Allied task force, the Japanese decide to quit while they're ahead and turn for home, leaving Turner's vulnerable transports untouched. Before dawn, as promised, Admiral Turner's ships pull anchor and head seaward with the rest of the Marine stores and supplies on board. Now alone and unsupported on Guadalcanal, Vandegrift and his Marines must dig in for the long, bitter days ahead. Shortly after dawn on August 9th, Vandegrift assembles his men. The Navy, for all its shortcomings, he tells them, has done its job. Now it's up to us to hold the ground. Remember, we're Marines. Vandegrift stakes out his perimeter. On a map, Guadalcanal looks accessible, but in reality, it is a chaotic tangle of ridges, ravines, and thick jungle. Vandegrift quickly realizes that he can't establish a continuous defense line across such terrain. Instead, he deftly assigns small units to key positions along the perimeter, with communication to be maintained by a system of outposts. In the event of an enemy penetration, Vandegrift plans to minimize the effects by launching vigorous counterattacks from his central reserve. Flexibility and coordination are the keys to Vandegrift's plan. He must shape his widely scattered forces into a cohesive whole. If he can't, America's tenuous foothold on Guadalcanal will be lost. Meanwhile, when Yamamoto learns that Admiral Turner has withdrawn his transports, he jumps to the erroneous conclusion that the Americans have abandoned the island. Quickly, he asks the commander of the 17th Imperial Army based at Rabaul to send a small force to Guadalcanal to mop up any American stragglers. On August 18th, out of sight of Marine lookouts, an 800-man detachment lands on Guadalcanal. But unknown to the Japanese, Guadalcanal is far from abandoned. Vandegrift is feverishly bringing in desperately needed air cover to his newly captured airstrip. 2 days after the Japanese landing, 31 American planes from the carrier Long Island land on Guadalcanal. Soon afterward, Vandegrift breaks a captured bottle of sake on the airstrip's last remaining building. He christens it Henderson Field, in honor of Major Lofton R. Henderson, the Marine hero of Midway who was killed leading his squadron of dive bombers against the Japanese. Henderson's flyers will become known as the Cactus Air Force, after Guadalcanal's code name of Cactus. They will play a crucial role in fending off the Japanese in the coming months. But for now, it falls to Vandegrift's Marines to hold the line. On August 21st, the Japanese detachment finds its way to the mouth of the Tenarue River near Vandegrift's perimeter. At 3:10 in the morning, all hell breaks loose as 250 screaming Japanese come tearing through the undergrowth at the dug-in Marines. But the U.S. Leathernecks are not panicked by the sudden charge. With grim determination, they unleash a hellstorm of fire at the attacking enemy. "50 minutes later, the sound of gunfire tapers off to the intermittent crackle of small arms. One company of Marines mops up the survivors of the initial attack. Meanwhile, the rest of Vandegrift's men in the area dig in and prepare for the main attack. They don't have long to wait. Japanese mortar fire and pack artillery cracks the silence. Vandegrift boldly sends a platoon of tanks to attack the rear of the Japanese. Then, just as his flexible defense plan had outlined, several of Vandegrift's units move forward to encircle the enemy in a powerful counterattack. Marine artillery fire levels the Japanese positions. By 5 p.m., it's all over. The Japanese force has been completely wiped out. The victory at the Tenarue River is a watershed for U.S. ground forces in the Pacific. Up until now, the Japanese fighting man has been unbeaten in every battle of the war. But Tenarue smashes the Japanese aura of invincibility once and for all. From here on out, it will be the U.S. Marines who will be staking out their own reputation as one of the toughest military units in existence. Yamamoto, who has now moved his headquarters to Rabaul, solemnly takes stock of the situation. He realizes his assessment of U.S. strength on the island has been totally wrong. Instead of abandoning Guadalcanal, the Americans are growing stronger every day. He now knows he will need more troops on the island to coordinate a land, sea, and air attack against Vandegrift's Marines. Soon, a force of fast Japanese destroyer transports carrying men and supplies establish a nightly shuttle to Guadalcanal known as the Tokyo Express. Gradually, Yamamoto begins to build up reinforcements for his counterattack. Meanwhile, east of the Solomons, a formation of 3 Japanese aircraft carriers is escorting a troop convoy towards Guadalcanal. Admiral Gormley orders Fletcher's carriers to intercept. On August 24th, the 2 fleets clash in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. Fletcher's planes draw first blood when they sink the light carrier Ryujo. But by attacking this small ship with all his forces, Fletcher has left himself open to attack by the 2 larger Japanese flat tops. Soon, dozens of Japanese planes are swarming around the USS Enterprise. A few of them manage to knife through the intense anti-aircraft fire and score 3 direct hits. Quick damage control keeps the Enterprise from going down. But Fletcher withdraws his fleet, allowing the Japanese to land their reinforcements on Guadalcanal. But the loss of a carrier and 90 planes is a severe blow to Yamamoto's forces. By the end of August, the Cactus Air Force can muster 64 planes. Even without the Navy at full strength, Vandegrift's Marines are slowly gaining the power to hold off the ever more furious Japanese attacks. The battle for Guadalcanal surges back and forth. The Americans continue to reinforce their troops on the island, and so do the Japanese. In addition, Yamamoto sends his warships in a series of daring raids to bombard Vandegrift's positions. But after 3 weeks, it becomes clear to Yamamoto that the battle for Guadalcanal must be settled on the ground. During the next week, more troops are transported via the Tokyo Express to Guadalcanal. On September 7th, Yamamoto calls a war council aboard his flagship. First, he orders Rabault's 11th Air Fleet to send every available plane to soften up Vandegrift's positions on the island. In concert with the air attacks, the force of 8,000 troops now on Guadalcanal will launch a crushing assault that will hurl the Americans into the sea. The following day, Allied reinforcements sent by Admiral Nimitz arrive at Guadalcanal to join the 17,000 men that are now on the island. Anticipating the Japanese attack, Vandegrift skillfully reinforces a key spot in his defensive line, a small escarpment, which will soon become known as Bloody Ridge. A few days later, Vandegrift receives a 6-page message from Admiral Gormley. Gormley's negative comments are overwhelming. He criticizes Vandegrift's strategy and dismisses it as futile. The upcoming battle, he concludes, is lost before it's begun. It is an extraordinary declaration on the eve of a major engagement, and Vandegrift is furious. But with the Japanese attack looming, he has no choice but to put his personal feelings aside. He has a battle to fight, and he means to win it, no matter what Admiral Gormley thinks. Suddenly at 9 p.m. on September 12th, Japanese flares illuminate Bloody Ridge, providing a target for the naval guns. The first 8-inch shells roll in like freight trains. When the barrage ends, the Japanese discard any attempt at stealth. Misled by faulty intelligence reports, they are unaware that they are actually outnumbered by the defenders. As a result, their strategy is to simply attack in human waves until the Americans are overwhelmed. As the first wave screams its way towards the perimeter wire, vicious hand-to-hand combat breaks out. Bodies of friend and enemy pile up on the battleground like stacks of sandbags. Then, as quickly as it began, the battle ends. The Japanese withdraw, but only for the time being. Later, both sides find themselves once again locked in a struggle so brutal that death seems like a consolation prize. For hours, the Japanese hurl themselves against the Marine positions. Vandegrift's artillery, now almost at point-blank range, creates a wall of steel against the intruders. Finally, it is over. The Japanese begin a painful retreat, leaving approximately 1,000 dead at Bloody Ridge, 250 at the Tenaru River, and 100 more at Alligator Creek. After this defeat, Yamamoto begins to realize that he is in for a bigger fight than he bargained for. But he still believes that his forces will ultimately prevail. During the 2 weeks following the Battle of Bloody Ridge, Allied air attacks on Japanese positions on Guadalcanal increase. Yamamoto senses an American buildup and quickly intensifies his efforts for a final decisive showdown. He mandates an all-out land, sea, and air attack. First, Henderson Field will be taken. Then, with Allied ground-based air power eliminated, the combined fleet will be safe to move in and annihilate the U.S. Navy. It is a bold and beautifully coordinated plan, but like all of Yamamoto's stratagems, it is highly complex and depends on perfect execution by everyone involved. There is little margin for error, but Yamamoto knows that the stakes are high, and with his gambler's instincts, he is willing to take the risk. The attack is set for October 15th. Yamamoto pledges all major elements of the combined fleet, telling his officers, the operation cannot be unsuccessful. But the Army insists that the attack be postponed while they move more reinforcements to the island. Reluctantly, Yamamoto agrees. Meanwhile, the Americans are having their own problems. On October 15th, Admiral Gormley sends a situation report to Admiral Nimitz, describing the plight of the Americans. Guadalcanal is virtually out of aviation gas. Japanese warships have attacked every night with impunity. Their bombardments have wrecked the airport installations, destroyed aircraft, killed men, and severely damaged troop morale. Gormley's message seals his fate. Convinced that decisive new leadership is needed to defeat Yamamoto, Admiral Nimitz sends Vice Admiral William F. Halsey to replace Gormley. This will prove to be a turning point in the campaign. Almost immediately, Halsey's appointment sends American morale soaring skyward, both in the Pacific Fleet and on Guadalcanal. Unlike Gormley, Halsey is unconcerned by the odds against him. He's determined to take the battle to the Japanese no matter what. Labeled bull by the American press for his fighting spirit, Halsey's first order to his men when he replaces Admiral Gormley is kill Japs. Kill Japs. Kill more Japs. Blunt statements like this are exactly what the sailors, the press, and the public need to hear. With Halsey in place, Nimitz borrows the 25th Division from the Army in Hawaii and sends it to Guadalcanal to reinforce Vandegrift. He also transfers more submarines, Army fighters, and B-17s from the Central to the South Pacific Command. Yamamoto also spares no effort to bolster his forces. But the Cactus Air Force, which has been growing stronger with each passing day, wreaks havoc with Yamamoto's transport and supply ships. On the island, Vandegrift senses something big brewing. But where exactly the blow will fall, he doesn't know. Meanwhile, the Japanese and American naval forces, playing hide and seek with each other, manage to reinforce their troops on the island. As D-Day for Yamamoto's offensive nears, he finds himself besieged by nagging problems. The Army continues to drag its feet, demanding yet another delay. In addition, his ship's consumption of fuel and the heavy losses to his air forces are extremely alarming. Yamamoto's problems go on and on. Each day that the Japanese Army fails to capture Henderson Field adds to the drain of food, ammunition, and other supplies. Soon, the rate of consumption will exceed the Navy's capacity to support it. By mid-October, Yamamoto is convinced that unless the Guadalcanal issue is resolved within 10 days, he has no confidence of victory. Henderson Field must be taken and taken quickly. Time is now on the side of the Americans. October 23, 1942. On Guadalcanal, the Japanese Army is finally ready. At 9 p.m., the bombardment begins. Half an hour later, the ground attack is unleashed. After a furious battle, lead elements of the Japanese break through the American lines and reach the edge of the airfield. Eager for victory, their commander prematurely radios division headquarters that the airfield is captured. Shortly after this announcement, Vandegrift orders a counterattack and the Japanese are wiped out. But Yamamoto believes that Henderson has been taken and that his fleet is now safe to attack the American Navy. He gives the order. At his headquarters in Noumea, Admiral Halsey issues his own orders. In stark contrast to the cautious Gormley, he demands that his fleet go on the offensive. The message he sends to his ship sums up his battle plan in 3 powerful words. Attack. Repeat. Attack. October 26th. The opposing carriers, 250 miles apart, launch their respective strikes at almost the same time, opening what will become known as the Battle of Santa Cruz. 74 fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes from the Hornet and the Enterprise fight their way through thick clouds of anti-aircraft fire and enemy interceptors. Meanwhile, the Japanese planes hit the carrier Hornet. Within minutes, she is dead in the water and on fire. Next in line is the Enterprise. 24 dive bombers zero in on her. One bomb strikes the forward end of her flight deck. Another twists her forward elevator. And a third ruptures her fuel tanks. But despite her injury, she takes aboard the Hornet's planes and fights on. At 5:20 p.m., the Hornet is ordered abandoned and sunk. At the end of the battle, Halsey has lost 1 carrier and a destroyer, with 283 men killed or missing. Yamamoto, on the other hand, has only 5 ships damaged. But one of them is a precious flat top, which will be out of action for 9 months. And U.S. planes have destroyed over 100 Japanese aircraft. These losses will severely weaken Yamamoto's ability to continue the campaign in the coming weeks. By the evening of the 26th, Vandegrift's Marines are mopping up the remnants of the defeated attack on Henderson Field. Late that night, Yamamoto receives the message that he's been dreading. In spite of the wholehearted cooperation of your fleet, writes the Chief of Staff of the 17th Army, our attempt to capture the enemy position at Guadalcanal airfield has failed. Yamamoto, the daring leader of the Japanese fleet, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, sends a painful message to the High Command. He states simply, we must abandon the effort to recapture Guadalcanal. But the Japanese High Command has become addicted to victory, and old habits die hard. Emperor Hirohito, whose displeasure makes brave men tremble, answers Yamamoto with a message that thinly veils his disappointment with the army. Stung by this rebuke, Yamamoto and the other commanders pledge to renew their efforts. 11 transports carrying over 13,000 troops are sent towards the island. They are covered by a powerful force of warships. On the night of November 13th, an American squadron of cruisers and destroyers stumbles on part of Yamamoto's fleet as they try to sneak in and bombard Henderson Field. What follows is one of the most confused and furious naval battles in history. The intermingled forces blaze away at each other in the darkness, sometimes at point-blank range. After 36 minutes, the survivors pull apart. The Japanese have lost a battleship and 2 cruisers. The Americans, 4 destroyers and a pair of cruisers. The planned attack on Henderson Field has been repulsed, but Yamamoto's transports are still at large. The next day, scouts from the carrier Enterprise suddenly stumble on the 11 Japanese troop ships and their escorts, now less than 200 miles off the Solomons. A wave of excitement electrifies Henderson Field. At 11:30 a.m., the first strike is mounted. The planes strafe the ships, drop their weapons, and head for home. Behind them in the water, long columns of black smoke reveal the impact of their bombs. 12:45 p.m. The second wave follows the first and delivers its lethal blows to the now disorganized column of ships. Soon, more American planes join in the attack. Wave after wave strafe, bomb, and torpedo the convoy. At sunset, the Americans secure for the night. The preliminary tally counts 7 of the 11 transports sunk, with 4 damaged but still functional. The next morning, patrol planes spot 3 of the 4 remaining transports on the beach off Guadalcanal's Tassafaronga Point. The 4th is lying in the water not far away. The pilots call for artillery. Within seconds, the big guns from both ship and shore demolish the Japanese transports. The smoke and fire from the iron hulks create a funeral pyre for the Japanese troops on board, and for Yamamoto's dream of recapturing Guadalcanal. On November 15th, the final curtain comes down on the naval battle for the island when, after another stinging defeat, Yamamoto withdraws his remaining ships. After 3 grim and bloody months, Nimitz, Vandegrift, and Halsey have engineered one of the most important American victories in all of World War II. A victory that would stop cold the Japanese onslaught in the Pacific and reverse the tide of war in favor of the Allies. In December 1942, the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal was replaced by the 2nd, which together with the Army's Americal Division, conducted mopping up operations until the island was officially secured on February 9, 1943. It had been exactly 6 months and 2 days since the first shots were fired on Guadalcanal. By this time, Admiral Nimitz was busy directing the next phase of the famous island hopping campaign that would ultimately end in the defeat of Japan. Admiral Halsey was rewarded with the 4th star of a full admiral. He retained command of the South Pacific, and later picked up the 5th star of a fleet admiral. In this role, he would lead the 3rd United States Fleet as it fought through the Pacific in support of Nimitz campaign until the end of the war. Late in 1943, General Vandegrift departed the Pacific to become the 18th Commandant of the Marine Corps. For his outstanding performance as commanding officer of the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal, he received the Medal of Honor, the highest award for valor the United States can bestow. With 20/20 hindsight, the outcome of the battle for Guadalcanal was perhaps inevitable. In a protracted campaign against the United States, Japan, with its limited resources in ships, aircraft, and men, never had more than a puncher's chance. On April 13, 1943, a Japanese radio transmission detailing Admiral Yamamoto's inspection tour of the frontline bases in New Guinea was intercepted by the Americans. By presidential decree, a flight of P-38 fighters with long-range gas tanks flew to Balale, intercepted Yamamoto's plane, and shot it down as it was preparing to land. With the death of Admiral Yamamoto, Japan's hopes for victory in the Pacific were doomed. The American planes that undertook this fateful mission had taken off from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal.